The only thing I remember afterwards is the bodies. The bodies in the water.
If you take a look at the games created by David Cage and Quantic Dream, you'll notice that each one of them is based around the supernatural to varying degrees. That is, except one. Aside from some of the technology that appears in it, Heavy Rain is a game based solely in reality. Put simply, it's about normal people in a normal world participating in a murder mystery story. But that wasn't always the case, so today we'll be looking at various aspects of Heavy Rain that ended up being scrapped, including cancelled downloadable prequel chapters and a removed supernatural element that would have radically changed the tone of the story. Needless to say, this video will contain spoilers for the entire game, so let's just jump right into it. First off, Heavy Rain wasn't originally meant to be a PlayStation 3 exclusive title. The idea for the game was first shown off in 2006 with a PlayStation 3 tech demo called The Casting, which featured a woman auditioning for a role in the game itself. It was meant to give people an impression of what kind of emotional scenes they'd be able to achieve with the technology of the time, which was capable of much more realistic and expressive facial animations than the previous generation. Personally, I think this demo has aged pretty poorly, though it's almost a decade old now, so you gotta cut it some slack. At this point, the game was being developed for the next-gen systems of the time and the PC, but in 2007 it was announced that Sony would be partnering with Quantic Dream as the game's publisher, resulting in its exclusivity. Microsoft was another publisher they looked to for the game, but according to David Cage in 2013, Microsoft took issue with the game being based around child kidnappings and wanted them to change it. It's interesting to think about how the game would have turned out if they hadn't stuck with their guns, but it's good to know they didn't have to change their vision like that based on what a publisher wanted. Well, actually, Quantic Dream's vision for the game is something even they weren't quite sure about. I'm of course talking about the supernatural elements I mentioned earlier. The original premise for the game was pretty much based entirely on a supernatural idea. Basically, when the main character, Ethan Mars, dove in front of a car to save his son at the beginning of the game, Scott Shelby, the origami killer, was in the crowd, and that caused them to form a spiritual bond with one another. From that point on, Ethan would be plagued with blackouts whenever Shelby would commit a murder. These would come in the form of strange visions where water would begin consuming the environment around him. Then Ethan would be taken to a flooded room made up of Shelby's memories. Ethan would be swimming through Shelby's mind and come across the body of his latest victim. When he woke up, he would find himself at Carnaby Square, which is where Shelby's brother died, the event that served as the catalyst for his murderous crusade. Not only that, but an origami figure would be found in his hand. According to a video Quantic Dream released about scenes that were left on the cutting room floor, it stated that this element of the story was removed only a few months before the end of development, and it honestly shows. Really, the game's story is virtually the same, except when Ethan has his blackouts, they've removed the scenes with the rushing water and flooded room. He still has blackouts in the exact same places in the story, wakes up in Carnaby Square, a location that Ethan has no reason to go to with the supernatural element removed, and has an origami figure in his hand, something that has no reason to be there. All of these visions point towards Ethan being out of his mind, and that would have caused both the player and Ethan himself to suspect that he might have some sort of split personality. I mean, he would be having visions of the victims before he even knew about them.
I've seen that face before.
Then at the end of the game it would have been resolved when Shelby is revealed to be the killer and the murders stop. In the final game, we're just supposed to assume Ethan is insane and has really weird blackouts out of nowhere as a result of being hit by a car.
I sometimes have these blackouts. Times when I don't know what I'm doing. I recover consciousness sometime later, but I'm someplace else. And I have no idea how I got there. Do you think this could be related to the accident?
You suffered a massive concussion and were in a coma for 6 months. We really don't know what effect a shock like that can have on the brain.
These blackouts just so happen to correspond with the killer, and he just so happens to wake up at the location where Shelby's brother died with an origami figure in his hand. Even with Shelby dealt with at the end of the game, I guess we're just supposed to assume Ethan continues to have sporadic blackouts that cause him to wake up in arbitrary locations because the blackouts have no actual tie to Shelby's murders. During this scene at the park, Ethan would have had a vision of his own son in the flooded room, and it would have totally made sense for Ethan to begin suspecting himself after he woke up and found his son had been kidnapped. Even though it was a red herring, the concept of trying to save your son from the other half of your fractured psyche that's forcing you to go through trials to prove your love, possibly as some sort of manifestation of guilt, is actually really interesting. But in the final game, I just don't buy it. I never really bought why Ethan would suspect himself, but with these scenes explicitly showing the victims, I can easily follow that line of reasoning. Everyone in the game suspects him, but he just comes across as an awkward weirdo, not guilty.
Ethan came home completely drenched at about 3. I asked him where he'd been. He spoke about drowning the rain. He didn't make any sense. There was something in his eyes. As if it wasn't really him. There may be no connection, but the next day there was that announcement about another victim of the origami killer.
I think my other self is testing me, testing my love for Sean. He wants to know if I love my son enough to save him. That means there's some part of me that knows where Sean is. But the only way to find him is to go through these trials. I kidnapped my son. But I can't remember what happened. I don't know where he is. But the only way to find him is to let me out of here. I'm the only person who can save him.
It doesn't make any sense!
It just doesn't make sense that they'd build a game around a concept and then remove that concept a few months before development ended without rewriting the story to fill in the holes it left. The whole game starts to make a lot more sense when you learn about this removed plotline, and it's hard for me to even think of the story of the game without naturally adding the supernatural element back into the plot just to make things fit together. They claim that they removed it because it was an overly complicated paranormal element that added nothing to the story, but it was pretty much the entire foundation of the story and the explanation for many things that happened in it.
The origami figure in my hand after my blackout. It's the same one the killer leaves in the hands of his victims. I've never done origami in my life.
Perhaps they thought people would take the game more seriously if it was grounded solely in reality, but if they did, considering their next game was completely based around the paranormal, they must have gotten over that idea. Interestingly, I found an interview with David Cage from back in 2006 where he states that Heavy Rain will have no supernatural elements in its story. So what happened? Did they decide to add in a supernatural angle and then remove it late into development even though it became the foundation of the story? It just seems strange to flip-flop on this one aspect of the game when it resulted in nothing but inconsistencies. They wanted to make what they thought was a better story by removing the supernatural elements, but honestly, it's a better story with them because it's more coherent. As long as they didn't pretend it didn't have a supernatural angle to it in advertisements, I don't think people would have disliked the game because of it. I totally understand wanting to make the game more grounded in reality, I just don't think that the transition away from the original idea for the game was done very well. These surreal and visually interesting scenes work well with the water motif of the game, and I think they would have done a great job grabbing the attention of players during the beginning sections of the game, which I often hear people complain about being boring. Aside from all that, they also showed footage of a potential scene where Shelby kills his mother at the end of the game. They decided this seemed out of character for him, but I guess it makes sense if you assume he was trying to silence her so she wouldn't reveal his identity to anyone. Another scrapped scene involved Ethan getting his son ready for school in the morning. It makes sense for them to remove this scene because the beginning of the game is already filled with many scenes where you just walk around a house. They also showed off a couple of potential scenes for the character Madison Page, which never made it past the concept art phase. Madison would have gone back to her newspaper office during various points in the game, where she would have done various tasks relating to the ongoing story. Madison's apartment would have also been in the middle of renovations, and in one scene during the beginning of the game, the player would have been able to paint and customize its layout in the way they wanted to. These scenes with Madison sound pretty interesting and would have given us a bit more insight into her character, but I guess it isn't too much of a loss that they didn't make the final cut. Another aspect of the game that never materialized was a series of downloadable prequel chapters called Heavy Rain Chronicles, which would have explored the backstories of the game's main characters. The only one that ever came out was Episode 1, The Taxidermist. This scene was actually a remade version of the vertical slice created for the game back in 2008. Other than that, various other scenes were mentioned, such as a scene that explained how Agent Nominated FBI got the scar on his face, as well as how he became addicted to the drug tryptocane. The scene would have taken him through his workplace in Washington, D.C., where he would have used his glasses for the first time and we would have learned about the death of his former partner. Another scene in this series would have explored Madison's past in Iraq as a war correspondent, which served as the origin of her insomnia and frequent nightmares. According to one of the developers of the game, this scrapped scene served as the inspiration for a scene in Beyond Two Souls. The last Heavy Rain Chronicles scene we know about would have explored the origins of the origami killer. We don't know much about this scene, but it would have put you in the shoes of the killer, meaning it would have been a scene featuring Shelby. Whether it was just about exploring Shelby's motivations, or it actually let us go through one of the previous trials he set up, we'll probably never know. The Heavy Rain Chronicles series was cancelled after just one episode because Quantic Dream needed more funding, but Sony preferred that they integrate PlayStation Move support into the game. Yep, remember these things? What a prosperous life they had. If I had to choose between more content based around interesting events and support for an alternative control scheme I'd never use, I'd definitely choose the additional content. Well, who knows, maybe you got some enjoyment out of it as an addition. I personally did not. Anyway, Heavy Rain definitely had a rough development full of twists and turns. The game was announced in 2006 and was originally going to come out in 2008, but as the game was delayed, ideas were brought on and dropped because their vision for the game changed. Without a doubt, we'd be looking at a much different Heavy Rain right now if these various elements made it into the final release. Whether certain choices made were the best choices that could have been made doesn't matter much, because stumbling is just a part of game development. And you never know how a game really turned out until you've stepped back and let the general public take it in. When you think about it, isn't that whole idea what Heavy Rain itself is all about? Making hard choices that stick. Maybe there are things I've mentioned in this video that the people at Quantic Dream regret changing or leaving out. Or maybe they're just happy with how the game turned out regardless of its flaws. Hopefully this was a learning experience for them and they'll put that knowledge to good use in their future projects. For us, it's just another interesting case of what could have been. Thanks for watching everyone, see you all next time.